Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be a part of this. The talks have been great. Um, I'm I'm a PhD student in the machine learning and healthcare lab at Johns Hopkins University, working with Suchi. And so a lot of the machine learning problems that we work on are motivated by our experiences sort of developing clinical decision support models, some of which we have actually deployed within the Hopkins Hospital Network. And through this, sort of a lot of the challenges, the practical challenges that come up that come through these sorts of deployments, we have to face them. And so this has informed our perspective on reliability, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So one place where one of the sort of broader reasons why this is so important is because in recent years, across a number of safety critical domains, we've been seeing machine learning go from being developed to actually deployed in large scale in a number of these industries. So, these are just some examples. But one of the things that becomes very clear when you take a good look at these systems and how critical they are and compare them to more traditional engineering systems, I'm thinking things like power plants or bridges, is that for machine learning systems, there's a real lack in terms of specification, standardization of the development process, monitoring, testing, maintenance. How do we do all of this? And so one of the things that Suchi and I did was we went through and we looked at the study of actually reliability engineering, which for these more traditional types of engineering systems is the study of exactly these things. How do we think about failures, and how do we manage failures? And we took some principles from reliability engineering and thought about how those apply to machine learning systems and the life cycle there. And so we extracted three main principles that we think are useful for designing machine learning systems that are reliable, namely failure prevention, which happens during development or prior to deployment, failure identification and reliability monitoring, which is some type of continuous monitoring that happens after deployment, and then protocols for being able to maintain and update the model over time. And so this was actually the subject of a tutorial we gave last year at the ACM conference on fairness, accountability, and transparency. I'll share my slides after. This is links to a video presentation, slides, as well as comprehensive references on this. But today what I'd like to talk about is in particular to focus on failure prevention and what does that look like for machine learning systems in the context of a particular source of failure. So there can be many reasons that machine learning models fail. We've seen examples of some of these. Here's one where biased data resulted in discriminatory performance of commercial facial recognition software, where we've now seen there's other issues with that. Another example that gets brought up are adversarial examples where a machine learning model is trained and it does well, but then imperceptible changes to the input, in this case, adding imperceptible noise to this panda image causes the model to make confident but completely wrong predictions when it would have been right on the original image. But I think more generally and perhaps sometimes more subtly, there's an issue that in machine learning it's called dataset shift, and I'll characterize it a little bit more after this example. But this is a very common kind of story, and there's many practical examples as well as research studies that show, and this is one. In this case, we're using chest X-rays in order to diagnose pneumonia. And what we see is that in this study, they developed a model using a large training data set. They measured its performance on this data, and they deemed that this model was high quality using this data set. So, they did cross-validation, they split their data set. But when the model was evaluated beyond that data set, what they found, and so that means that new hospitals and new medical centers, what they found was that the performance significantly degraded. And what was going on is that, this X-ray has style features. In this case, in the left X-ray, there's an L, and in the right X-ray, there's a token that's a backwards L. This actually encodes geometry. So this is telling you if it's a front to back or a back to front X-ray. And this is important. This is important geometric information for how you interpret the image. But unfortunately, when you just apply machine learning to this, it's able to actually directly use these style features in order to predict pneumonia. And so due to differences in equipment, due to differences in hospital policies, you can end up with associations between pneumonia and these kinds of style features and to use those for prediction. And these are very brittle types of dependencies that don't generalize. And so more generally, dataset shift is about this problem where the context in which the model was trained, and so these artifacts of the training dataset don't generalize to the deployment context. And so these can be due to differences in equipment, differences in population, different demographics, or more subtly, these can also be about how human behavior has been encoded into the data, which is this next example, which shows, this is closer to our own work where we use electronic health record data. So in this case, we're using lab signs, lab tests, and vital signs in order to predict the risk of in-hospital deterioration. And what we see is that, what we've seen is that if we train on sort of early years data and train a model, over time, the performance will start to deteriorate significantly. And in this case, it's because the model learns a behavioral association that's based off of the ordering patterns of clinicians. So here I've circled lactate. The main point here is that when lactate begins to be measured, it actually corresponds with this patient for when they're deteriorating, as noted by the spike in creatinine value. And so you learn based off of this timing information, which is dependent on policies and practice patterns. You learn to predict deterioration based off these, but because healthcare practices evolve over time, this actually leads to poor performance once it goes live. So the question we're left with then is, when we have these types of shifts, and as we saw, they can be due to a wide variety of reasons: equipment, population, behavior, if not more. How can we prevent these failures? We're thinking about failure prevention, and how can we learn models that are actually stable to these shifts? And so most methodological work that thinks about this is very data-driven, and so as a result, it's rather reactive. So what this means is that most solutions and most existing methodologies think about, you have your training data set, but then you're actually able to get data from your intended deployment application, and you're able to use that during the training process in order to learn a model that's actually directly optimized for that final environment. But the thing about that is that's not really the way machine learning models are served today, because a lot of them are hosted in the cloud, and it's some sort of pre-trained system that then consumers sort of buy into and access. And so it's a sort of one model fits all kind of situation, in which case we don't have data to start with. We don't have data from all our new users, and so we can't use this during learning in order to do that. And so this kind of reactive way of updating models based off these new samples isn't really going to help us prevent failures prior to deployment. So in contrast, what we're interested in are proactive learning approaches, which try to anticipate the problematic types of shifts that can occur, so that we can sort of make guarantees ahead of time about what failures you're protected against. And so as a high-level overview of what proactive methods consist of, this is going to be the case we're talking about for dataset shift. What we need is a language for actually expressing and identifying what are the shifts that could be problematic for our problem. And once we have this representation, then we can actually go through, we can look at it, and we can identify what are the things that we think we need to protect against, what are the things we don't. And as a result, we can end up with what we call an invariant specification, which will let us actually express what are the desired invariances we want. And then we can use some sort of proactive learning algorithm in order to learn a model that satisfies those desired invariances. And ideally then has guarantees, some safety guarantees to go along with it. So in this part, I'm just going to focus on the first parts and sort of leave some of the technical details in a paper that we have. But the point is that we're going to use graphs, in particular directed acyclic graphs, in order to represent the prediction problem that we're working with and the data generating process. So if you think of a simplified version of the pneumonia example, where we're predicting our target condition, pneumonia from chest x-rays and style features, we might say that the way that these variables are related is like this. And where the arrows are denoting sort of the generative mechanisms that generated the data. And we can inspect these and actually determine like which of these do we think are going to be stable between training and deployment, and which of these are going to be unstable and are going to vary. And so, you know, how pneumonia and the style features manifest themselves on the X-ray image is actually something that's going to be the same across hospitals. The pneumonia shows up as white patches on X-rays, and that's something that is signal that we know is going to be valid at any hospital. But associations that are based off the choice of style features, which could be due to equipment or protocols or technician preferences, how the style features are chosen, that actually is something that's going to vary. And so that's something that we would want our resulting model to be stable to, and sort of to make predictions that are invariant to changes in the protocols and how these features are chosen. So we can apply this sort of thinking to more complex problems. And so in our work, one of the things we do is look at a condition called sepsis. And so we can relate, again, we can use this graph to think about the structure of our problem, where, you know, if we want to predict infection and we have these important signals, physiologic signals like platelets or INR, and we can think about the other factors that we know about like treatments and demographics. And what we can do is we can augment the structure with pieces that actually point out, here's shifts that we're concerned about. I'm worried about changes in how anticoagulants are prescribed, or I'm worried in how antiplatelet agents are prescribed. And so we can actually declare and specify, these are the problematic pieces that we want stability to. And just to show that, you know, this really can work for more complex problems, that was really just a piece of a larger part of the sepsis graph that sort of we're constantly developing and working with. And so the point is, once we have this invariant specification, which is this structure, this graphical structure, as well as the developer declared invariances that we want, then sort of the algorithmic piece, which I won't go into, is we can actually take this and we have a way to then use proactive learning techniques to figure out what are the pieces of my data that I need to model, and how do I combine them in order to make predictions that will ultimately satisfy those invariances that I said that I wanted in my invariance spec. And so to just walk through a brief example, going back to the clinical decision support task, where we're taking electronic health record data, and now we're going to be predicting mortality. What we can do is we actually have algorithms. So this isn't completely data driven, and this doesn't completely come from prior knowledge and working with domain experts. It's actually a synthesis of the two. You can learn the graphical structure for the invariant spec from data. And so I'll show a zoomed in version of this. But the point is, we can take our data sets and we can actually learn the structure from them, along with incorporating our prior knowledge into it. And we can then, again, we can do this sort of inspection where it's again, this bridge between being data-driven, but also we want the developers to be thinking and specifying their desired invariances. So in this case, we see across data sets, so data set ID being hospital, across hospitals, we can look at what are factors that are linked to the hospital as things that the graph suggests shifted across data sets. And so what we see is that the age distribution was different across data sets, and that lab times, so these ordering patterns, differed across hospitals. And we can also then reason about which of these are actually going to be problematic, which of these are actually things we want to protect against. So here, lab timing actually has an edge to mortality, which is saying that it's actually associated with mortality. And if we were to use that to predict, then we run into the problem that we spoke about here, where a naive model that we trained deteriorated when we did sort of looking forward on how its performance changes over time. So what we can do again is we inspect the graph, we have these desired invariances, and so we declare that we want stability to shifts in these lab ordering patterns. And again, sort of this black box algorithm that then lets us do proactive learning and results in a model that satisfies these. And now what happens is we get tangible gains where here for 3 types of models trained on one hospital, and then we try evaluating it at 3 different hospitals within the hospital network. What we see is that by using the invariance spec and thinking about what things to protect against, the stable models result in sort of more consistent performance across sites, and that, which is so I-SPEC using the invariance specification yields to more consistent performance and high performance across sites, but sort of just trying to be data driven about things and not accounting for these differences either leads to consistently poor performance or performance that sort of deteriorates significantly and is highly variant. And so that's exactly what leads to failures. So I'm going to skip this. There's essentially other benefits that we get from thinking about stability and this declarative approach to achieving invariance. And so that full end-to-end framework for how do we go from data, how do we incorporate knowledge, how do we build out our invariance spec, and then ultimately then take it to train models that have these guarantees is what we talk about in this paper. And a more general overview about these sorts of data set shift issues and how they arise and how to manage them in healthcare applications is another topic that we've talked about and sort of there's more information available about. And so I'll just leave with, this was just one piece of the story, a particular type of failure and a particular approach then for performing failure prevention, but that, you know, reliability really consists of failure prevention, test time monitoring, and maintenance. And so we have to think about and balance all of these.